The first story comes from the outskirts of Carmax, where a man named Riley worked as a seasonal ranger. He claimed that late one winter, he discovered massive footprints near an abandoned mining road. These weren't ordinary animal prints. They were human, shaped but nearly 2 feet long, spaced impossibly far apart, as if whatever left them had a stride several times larger than any person. Riley tried to follow them, but quickly lost them where the snow had been disturbed in a strange circular pattern, almost like something had landed or spun. Over the following nights, he heard heavy footfalls outside his cabin, always stopping just beyond the tree line. One night he woke to the sound of breathing, slow and deep, right outside his window. He froze in bed, listening as the doorknob rattled softly, like someone testing it. Riley moved away from Yukon that spring and never returned to that cabin. The next story centers around a snowmobiler named Hannah, who became lost during a sudden storm near Keno Hill. She was experienced and carried emergency supplies, but she later told search and rescue teams that she hadn't been alone during the storm. She said a tall figure walked beside her for hours, never speaking, never falling behind. When she finally reached a small cabin and took shelter, she watched the figure stop just outside the clearing and remain completely still. Even as the blizzard passed, the silhouette didn't move. In the morning it was gone, leaving behind long drag marks in the snow, as if something had been pulled away. Hannah couldn't describe the figure's face because she said she never saw one, only a completely black outline against the white storm. Farther south, near the tiny settlement of Breburn, a couple living off grid reported a series of events involving whispering voices in the forest. It began when the husband, Daniel, heard someone calling his name at dawn, even though he and his wife were the only ones within miles. Over the next few days, both of them heard conversations outside their cabin, voices that sounded like familiar people from their past family members, old friends, even neighbors they hadn't seen in years. The voices always came at night, always from just beyond the trees, and always sounded like they were trying to lure them outside. One night, Daniel stepped out with a flashlight and saw nothing except trees swaying in a wind that didn't match the voices. Final night, both heard their own voices calling each other from the dark. That was enough. They moved back to Whitehorse and never spent another night in the forest. Another disturbing Yukon story involves a pair of truckers driving along the isolated Silver Trail. Late one night, they spotted a figure standing in the middle of the road, wearing a long coat and holding what looked like a lantern. As they slowed, the figure lifted the lantern and let it drop to the ground, shattering it. The light extinguished instantly, but the figure didn't move. The truckers said the figure's eyes reflected their headlights like an animal's, glowing a pale yellow. When they swerved around and looked in the mirrors, the figure was gone, even though the road behind them was a straight stretch with nowhere to hide. They reported the incident thinking it might have been a stranded traveler, but local authorities said the description matched similar sightings going back decades, long before modern vehicles traveled that road. Near Dawson City, an elder from a local community spoke about a strange creature that only appears during late autumn. He described it as thin, long-limbed, and able to blend with the trees by changing the color of its skin. He said the creature mimicked sounds, wood cracks, footsteps, even animals in distress, allure people off paths. One hunter who went missing in 2014 was believed to have been following what he thought was a wounded caribou. Search teams later found his tracks wandering in circles, then leading straight into a dense patch of forest before abruptly stopping. No body was ever found. But several search volunteers claimed they heard mimic sounds in the distance, including someone crying for help, followed by sudden silence. Deeper into the Yukon's remote areas, a prospector named Wes lived alone in a tiny shack. One winter, he began seeing strange lights moving along the tree lines, off blue glows drifting silently like floating orbs. At first, he assumed they were reflections from distant camps or snowmobiles, but he eventually realized they moved in ways no human light could. He described them as playfully drifting close, then darting away as if teasing him. One night, several lights surrounded his shack, pulsing faintly like they were breathing. His generator malfunctioned. His radio cut off. The temperature inside dropped sharply, frost forming on his walls. Then the lights vanished all at once. Wes left the next morning with only a backpack and didn't even bother locking the door. He told friends he felt watched the entire trek out of the wilderness, but he never looked back. Another unsettling Yukon story involves a woman named Karen who rented a historic cabin near the old Klondike gold rush routes. She often heard footsteps overhead in the attic, even though the property owner insisted it was sealed and inaccessible. When she finally pushed open the attic door, she found nothing but dust and old furniture. But the footprints on the dusty floor weren't hers. Over the next week, Karen started noticing changes in the cabin. Drawers left open, chairs moved, the front door unlocked, even though she remembered locking it. The final incident happened when she woke to the attic door wide open, even though she hadn't touched it since the first day. She moved out that morning and refused to speak about the cabin after that. In another remote area close to Watson Lake, a group of campers encountered something terrifying while hiking near a frozen lake. They said they found a massive hole in the ice, far too large to be made by any local animal. Around it were claw marks carved into the surface, spaced evenly like fingers from something trying to pull itself out or pull something in. That night, the group heard loud splashes and bubbling from under the ice, followed by a deep rumbling sound that traveled along the lake. One camper claimed he saw something large move beneath the surface, creating a long shadow that stretched across the frozen water. They left the next morning and swore never to camp near the lake again. Then there's the story of an abandoned research station deep in the mountains, built decades ago to monitor weather conditions. A team of explorers visited the site in 2019 and found pages of scattered notes inside, most of them damaged by weather. But one entry stood out. It described a strange humming sound that vibrated through the metal structure every night. The team reported that the same humming returned on their second night there. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't mechanical. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a distant chant. One explorer woke to find the door open and fresh snow inside, even though the others insisted no one had gone outside. They left before dawn, abandoning valuable equipment. Later analysis suggested the humming was not natural, but no one has been willing to return to gather more evidence. Another chilling story comes from a teacher who worked in a tiny northern community. She lived in government housing and often stayed late preparing lessons. One night she heard knocking on her door at 2 a.m. When she opened it, no one was there, but fresh footprints in the snow led to the edge of the forest. The next night, the knocking returned, louder this time, insistent and frantic. She looked through the peephole and saw a figure standing still, facing the door but without any visible features. When she blinked, it moved slightly closer. She backed away, called a local officer, and stayed on the phone until she heard the officer arrive. When she opened the door, he said there had been nothing outside, not even footprints. Still deeper into Yukon's wilderness, another story involves a trapper named Joel, who spent most of his life working in harsh winter conditions. One night, he heard his sled dogs growling fiercely at something outside the kennel. When he stepped out with a lamp, the dogs quieted instantly, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Joel noticed strange tracks in the snow, large, circular prints arranged in a perfect line, almost like holes punched into the ground. The tracks continued far into the trees but didn't match any known animal. The next morning, 2 of his dogs were missing, their chains broken cleanly, as though something had lifted them straight up. Their tracks ended in the same circular pattern. Joel left trapping after that season. A chilling encounter near Pelly Crossing involved a long-haul bus driver who often traveled at night. He said he once picked up a young woman standing alone near the road in freezing temperatures. She didn't speak much, only saying she needed to get to the next town. After a few minutes, the driver noticed she wasn't breathing normally. She didn't seem to be breathing at all. When he looked down briefly and then back up, she was gone, vanished from the seat without opening the door. Her silence lingered in the air like a fog. The driver later learned that multiple people had reported seeing a woman matching her description over the years, always alone on icy roads, always vanishing when approached. Another surviving account comes from a prospector who claimed that the forest itself seemed alive. He said the trees moved even without wind, swaying subtly whenever he walked past. At night he heard cracking sounds followed by quiet rustling as though something large crawled along the forest floor. He described seeing two trees shift closer together overnight, blocking the entrance to his camp. On the final evening, he saw a silhouette standing between the trees, tall and unnaturally thin. When he turned his head for a moment, the silhouette vanished, but the tree branches continued swaying as though something had just brushed past. He packed up and hiked out before dawn. Another terrifying experience came from a group of geologists doing surveys far from civilization. They camped near a rocky ridge and were awakened by what sounded like deep growls echoing through the valley. When they climbed the ridge the next morning, they found enormous claw marks carved into the stone itself, marks that no ordinary animal could have made. The team was so disturbed that they cut their expedition short. One member said he watched the entire hike back, and at one point saw a massive black-shaped dart between boulders far below them. Even more disturbing is the story of an elderly man from the White Horse area who frequently walked alone in the forest. One evening he didn't return, and a small search group looked for him. They found his footprints leading toward the riverbank, then stopping abruptly as though he had vanished mid-step. Searchers reported hearing soft whistling coming from the trees. Not a melody, more like a warning. The whistling stopped whenever anyone called out his name. His body was never discovered. Another strange case occurred near a remote lodge where guests frequently reported seeing shadows moving across the walls even when no one was walking by. One guest said she saw a shadow standing in the doorway of her room, tall and motionless, even though the hallway lights were off. When she turned on her lamp, the shadow vanished instantly. The lodge owner said shadows had been part of the building's history since it was constructed. Staff members often refused to work nights because they claimed the shadows lingered even when the rooms were empty, bending at angles that made no sense. One story, told by a hunter, described something even more terrifying. He said he once followed what he thought was a moose trail into the thick forest, but the deeper he went, the quieter the woods became. No wind, no birds, no distant echoes. He reached a clearing and found dozens of bones arranged neatly in a circle, each one cleaned as if something had gnawed every trace of flesh off. In the center of the circle lay a single boot frozen in place. When he turned to leave, he heard loud snapping branches behind him, but saw nothing. He ran until he reached his truck, convinced something had been stalking him the entire time. Another unsettling Yukon horror tale involves an older cabin near the Stewart River. Travelers stayed there overnight and reported strange tapping sounds on the walls. The tapping grew louder as night went on, moving from one corner to another, like fingers trailing along the wooden panels. When he shouted for it to stop, the tapping paused before slamming into the wall behind his bed with tremendous force. The traveler didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, he found deep scratches on the outside logs, arranged in deliberate patterns. Finally, one of the most disturbing stories comes from a snowplow driver working during a heavy storm. He said that while clearing the highway, he saw a pale figure crawling across the snow. When his headlights hit it, the figure froze, slowly lifting its head. Its limbs were long and bent at impossible angles. He backed up immediately and radioed the sighting, but when teams arrived 15 minutes later, there were no signs of anything, just fresh snow and wind. But the driver insisted the figure wasn't human, and he never worked night shifts again. Yukon remains one of the most isolated regions in North America. With long stretches of untouched wilderness and months of cold darkness, it's no surprise that countless eerie encounters continue to be shared by locals, travelers, hunters, and explorers. These 10 stories remind us that some mysteries stay hidden in the snow-covered forests, waiting silently in the cold. If you ever plan to explore the Yukon, remember these accounts and stay aware of what might be lurking just beyond the trees in the frozen silence.